When Officer Jack Carter responds to a routine call, he uncovers the heart-wrenching story of Eli Barnes, a veteran living in isolation and grief. With the loss of his beloved dog and a life weighed down by loneliness, Eli is on the brink of giving up. Jack steps in, determined to help Eli rediscover hope and rebuild his life. Through unexpected friendships, community support, and the arrival of a new companion, Eli's journey becomes one of resilience, healing, and second chances. What challenges will they face along the way? Can Eli find peace after all he's lost? Comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hope and transformation. The small town of Harper's Ridge lay quiet beneath the starless sky. The usual hum of life had dwindled to nothing as the town settled into the stillness of night. Streetlights cast soft glows along empty sidewalks, while the occasional rustle of leaves was the only sound breaking the silence. In the midst of it, a patrol car cruised slowly, its headlights slicing through the dim. Officer Jack Carter leaned back in his seat, his gray eyes scanning the familiar streets with the practiced indifference of a man who had done this for decades. At 56, Jack had seen more than his share of the town's troubles. There was a weight to his gaze, an exhaustion that clung to him, but he still carried himself with the poise of someone who knew his job mattered. Beside him, Olivia Harris, his 34-year-old partner, sat in quiet focus. She had only been working with Jack for a few months, but Jack had quickly learned to appreciate her steady, thoughtful nature. There was an intelligence in her that reminded him of his younger self. Sharp, driven, but not yet burdened by the years of seeing people at their worst. Jack glanced over at her, breaking the comfortable silence. "So, Harris, how's Harper's Ridge treating you?" "I imagine it's a bit different from Chicago." Olivia smirked, her brown eyes flicking toward him for a moment before returning to the road. "It's quieter," she admitted. "I miss the pace of the city sometimes, but Harper's Ridge has its charm. People here actually know each other. There's something nice about that." Jack nodded, his lips curling into a small, understanding smile. "Give it time. This place grows on you. You start to see that small-town life has its own rhythm." Before Olivia could respond, the radio crackled to life. The dispatcher's voice, sharp and clear, filled the car. "All units, we have a report of a possible break-in at 742 Oakwood Drive. Caller identifies as Eli Barnes, 81-year-old male. Repeat, possible burglary in progress." Jack straightened in his seat. His hand moved instinctively to the radio. "Unit 7 responding," he said, his voice steady. He glanced at Olivia as he flipped on the siren. "Let's go check this out." As the patrol car sped through the quiet streets, Jack's mind churned with thoughts. Burglary calls were common enough, but something about this one unsettled him. Maybe it was the age of the caller, 81, and living out there alone. Oakwood Drive was on the outskirts of town, where old homes sat isolated, tucked away behind overgrown lawns and thick trees. "You know this Barnes guy?" Olivia asked, cutting through Jack's thoughts as they raced past darkened homes, the red and blue lights flashing against the empty windows. Jack shook his head. "Not personally. Heard the name before. He's an old vet, lives alone with his dog, I think. His place is pretty run down from what I've been told. Quiet guy, keeps to himself. Seems like an odd target for a burglar," Olivia mused. "Not much to steal out there." "That's what worries me," Jack muttered. "It's isolated, perfect for someone looking to break in without being seen." As they turned onto Oakwood Drive, the houses became more spread out. The road was lined with dense woods, making the area feel remote, cut off from the rest of town. Ahead, a single porch light flickered weakly, casting shadows over the unkempt yard. The house itself was dark, save for that one dim light. Jack pulled up to the curb, the sense of unease growing stronger. "Keep your eyes open," he said softly as he stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the cold night air. Olivia followed, her hand instinctively checking her holster as they approached the house. The place looked abandoned. weather-beaten and sagging under the weight of years. The overgrown lawn, coated in a light dusting of snow, only added to the eerie silence. On the porch stood an elderly man, barely visible in the weak light. Beside him was a dog, an old Labrador retriever, its graying muzzle, a clear sign of age. "Mr. Barnes?" Jack called out as they approached, his voice calm but authoritative. "I'm Officer Carter, and this is Officer Harris. We got your call about a break-in." Eli Barnes nodded slowly, his movements sluggish, as if each one took great effort. "I heard some noise like glass breaking," he rasped. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, as though he hadn't spoken in days. "When I went to check, the window in the back was busted. Buddy, my dog, he started barking like crazy, must have scared them off." Jack glanced down at Buddy, whose tail gave a weak wag, but who otherwise remained still, watching the officers warily. "Mind if we take a look around?" Olivia asked, her tone gentle. Eli nodded again, gesturing toward the back of the house. "Go ahead. I didn't see anyone, just heard the noise." Jack and Olivia followed Eli around the side of the house, their footsteps crunching softly in the snow. The house loomed dark and silent, its windows like empty eyes staring out into the night. When they reached the back, Jack's flashlight beam caught the glint of broken glass scattered across the snow beneath a shattered window. "There it is," Eli muttered, pointing to the window. His breath came in labored gasps, as though the short walk had taken a toll on him. Jack moved closer, examining the glass and the size of the hole in the window. Something about it didn't quite sit right with him. It looked more like a deliberate break than an accidental one. His instincts, honed over years on the job, told him to be cautious. "Footprints," Olivia called out, her flashlight sweeping across the ground. "Looks like they're heading toward the street." Jack straightened, making mental notes as he scanned the area. Everything seemed to line up with Eli's story, but that nagging feeling of unease refused to leave him. He turned back to Eli, who was standing a few feet away, his hand resting on Buddy's head for support. "Mr. Barnes, did you hear or see anything else? Any voices, any vehicles?" Eli shook his head slowly. "No, just the glass breaking. By the time I got to the window, whoever it was had already gone." Jack nodded, but his instincts told him there was more to this situation than met the eye. "Would you mind if we took a look inside, just to make sure everything's secure?" he asked carefully, to keep his tone neutral. For a brief moment, Jack thought he saw something flicker across Eli's face. Hesitation, maybe even fear. But it was gone so quickly that Jack wasn't sure he'd seen it at all. After a pause, Eli nodded. "I suppose that'd be fine. Come on in." As they followed Eli back around to the front of the house, Jack exchanged a glance with Olivia. She nodded slightly, confirming that she too sensed something was off. They climbed the creaking porch steps, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this call was about to become something much more complicated than a simple attempted burglary. The moment Jack stepped through the door of Eli's house, the smell hit him. Stale air, musty with the scent of damp and neglect. The interior was dimly lit, with only a single bulb hanging from the ceiling casting a weak glow. The warmth inside was oppressive, far too intense for the frigid winter night outside. The house itself was small and cluttered. Piles of old newspapers were stacked haphazardly in the corners, and worn furniture sat in various states of disrepair. Everything felt cramped, as if years of life had piled up and choked the space. Jack's eyes adjusted to the dim light as he scanned the room. The silence inside was as heavy as the warmth. "This way," Eli muttered, leading them toward the kitchen, where the broken window was located. His footsteps were slow, his breathing labored. Buddy padded alongside him, the dog's nails clicking softly on the linoleum floor. As they passed through the narrow hallway, Jack took in more of the house. Dust-covered photos on the walls, cabinets crammed with forgotten knickknacks, and a sense of overwhelming loneliness that seemed to permeate every corner. Jack's heart sank a little. It was clear that Eli had been living like this for some time, cut off from the world, struggling to maintain even the smallest semblance of normalcy. When they reached the kitchen, Jack crouched down to examine the broken window. Glass shards glittered on the floor beneath it, catching the light from the single bare bulb above. The cold air from outside seeped in through the broken pane, chilling the already stuffy room. Jack's flashlight flicked over the window, and again that same unease tugged at him. Something about the break didn't feel random. "Mr. Barnes," Jack said, turning to look at Eli, who was leaning heavily against the counter, his face pale and drawn. "Are you sure you didn't hear anything else? No voices? No car engine?" Eli shook his head. "No, nothing. Just the glass breaking." Jack stood up, studying Eli's face for a moment. The old man was clearly struggling, physically, emotionally, but there was something more. Jack could sense it, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it yet. "Mr. Barnes," Olivia's voice cut through the silence. She was standing near the stove, her brow furrowed. "Is your stove supposed to be on?" Eli's eyes flicked toward the stove, and for a brief second, Jack saw something flash across his face. Guilt, maybe even fear. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that same weary expression. I use it to keep the place warm," Eli mumbled, his voice barely audible. "The furnace went out last winter, and I haven't been able to get it fixed. Electricity's too expensive, so the stove, well, it's all I got." Jack felt a knot form in his stomach. The stove was the only source of heat in this house. The temperature inside suddenly made sense. It wasn't just warm, it was stifling, dangerous. Eli had been using the gas stove to heat his home, a desperate measure in a desperate situation. "Mr. Barnes," Jack said, his voice gentle but firm. "Using the stove for heat like this is really dangerous. The risk of fire or carbon monoxide poisoning is high. How long have you been doing this?" Eli's shoulders slumped, the fight seeming to drain out of him all at once. "A while," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't have a choice. It's just me and Buddy here. We make do." The admission hung heavy in the air. Jack exchanged a glance with Olivia, who nodded slightly, her expression mirroring his concern. This wasn't just a case of a broken window. This was a man barely surviving, living on the edge of disaster. Jack felt a surge of frustration at the system that had failed men like Eli, veterans who had served their country only to be forgotten. "Mr. Barnes," Jack began, carefully choosing his words. "When was the last time you saw a doctor? Had a proper meal?" Eli's eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and shame. "I don't need no charity, officer," he snapped, some of his earlier fire returning. "I've been fine on my own for years. I don't need nobody's help." But even as he spoke, Jack could hear the weakness in his voice, exhaustion. Eli was a man at the end of his rope, clinging to the last shreds of his independence with a grip that was rapidly slipping. "Look," Jack said softly, taking a step closer. "I know you're proud, and I know you've been through a lot. But it's okay to need help. We all do sometimes." Eli didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the floor. Buddy, sensing his master's distress, leaned against Eli's leg, his tail thumping weakly. The old man's hand rested on the dog's head, trembling slightly. "We'll get you some help," Jack said, his voice gentle but firm. "There are resources, people who can help with the furnace, with food, with whatever you need." For a long moment, Eli was silent. Jack could see the battle playing out in his mind, the pride warring with the reality of his situation. Finally, Eli sighed, his shoulders slumping further. "I don't know," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I've been let down before. People make promises, but when it comes down to it, they don't want to deal with an old black veteran and his problems." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with years of pain and disappointment. Jack felt a pang in his chest, recognizing the deep-seated hurt behind Eli's statement. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "This isn't charity," Jack said quietly. "This is one man helping another. You served your country, Mr. Barnes. You deserve to be treated with dignity and respect." Eli's eyes met Jack's for the first time since they'd entered the house, and for a brief moment, Jack thought he saw a flicker of hope, of something that had long been buried beneath the layers of pride and pain, but just as quickly, it was gone. "I'll think about it," Eli muttered, turning away. "But I've managed this long on my own, and I'll keep on managing." Jack knew better than to push. He nodded, stepping back. "All right, Mr. Barnes, but if you change your mind, you give me a call, day or night." As they made their way back to the front door, Jack handed Eli his card. The old man stared at it for a long moment before slipping it into his pocket. "Thank you, officer," he muttered, though his voice held little conviction. Jack stood on the porch for a moment, the cold night air biting at his skin. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving Eli in a situation that could go south at any moment. He had seen a lot in his years on the force, but something about this case, the quiet desperation, the pride masking fear, hit him harder than he expected. As Jack climbed back into the patrol car, Olivia shot him a glance. "You all right?" Jack nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "Yeah, it's just, sometimes doing what we can doesn't feel like enough." The rest of their shift passed in a blur, but Jack's mind kept drifting back to the image of Eli and Buddy in that cold, cluttered house. He had a sinking feeling that this wasn't the last time he would be called to Oakwood Drive. Several days passed after Jack and Olivia's visit to Eli Barnes's home, but the image of that frail old man and his loyal dog, clinging to each other in a house that was falling apart, haunted Jack's thoughts. He found himself driving by Oakwood Drive more often than usual, hoping to catch a glimpse of Eli outside, but the house always looked as if it had that night, dark, silent, closed off from the world. Jack had followed up with social services, but as expected, they were slow to act. He'd put in calls to the local Veterans Affairs office as well, trying to get someone to check on Eli's situation, but there was a backlog of cases. Eli's case was just one of many. It frustrated Jack, this feeling of helplessness, knowing that despite his best efforts, the system was failing a man who had already failed so many times before. Every time Jack thought of Eli heating his house with that old gas stove, the knot in his stomach tightened. On a particularly cold night, Jack had just settled into his worn armchair, a cold beer in hand, when his phone buzzed on the coffee table. The number on the screen wasn't one he recognized, and for a moment he considered letting it go to voicemail. But something made him reach for the phone. "Carter here," he answered, his voice still tinged with the exhaustion of the day. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled with the sound of labored breathing. Then, finally, a familiar voice, quieter and more broken than he remembered. "Officer, it's Eli." Eli Barnes. Jack sat up straight, instantly alert. "Eli, is everything all right?" Another pause. This one even longer. When Eli spoke again, his voice was shaky, almost a whisper. "It's Buddy. He's not doing well. I don't know what to do." Jack felt his heart sink. The desperation in Eli's voice was palpable. Gone was the stubborn pride, replaced by fear, by vulnerability. Eli had reached out because he didn't have anyone else. "What's wrong with Buddy?" Jack asked, already reaching for his jacket. "He won't eat," Eli choked out. "Hasn't for days. He's so weak. He can barely lift his head. I can't lose him, officer. He's all I've got." Jack felt a lump forming in his throat. He knew, just as Eli did, that Buddy was more than just a dog. He was family, a lifeline. The thought of Eli losing Buddy, of that house being empty, save for Eli's quiet grief, was almost unbearable. "Have you taken him to the vet?" Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. "I can't afford it," Eli admitted, his voice filled with shame and frustration. "I've been trying to save up, but between food and keeping the heat on, I just don't have enough. I thought I thought I could handle it on my own, but—" His voice trailed off into silence, and Jack could hear the sound of muffled sobbing on the other end of the line. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, gripping the phone tightly. The weight of Eli's situation pressed down on him. This wasn't just about a sick dog. This was about a man who had been fighting a losing battle for too long. "All right, Eli," Jack said, his voice calm and reassuring. "I'm coming over right now. We'll figure this out together, okay? Just hang in there and keep Buddy comfortable. I'll be there soon." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, then a soft, barely audible, "Thank you." The vulnerability in those two words cut through Jack's heart. Eli had spent so long being proud, refusing help, but now he was reaching out, and Jack knew things must be dire. As he raced through the quiet streets toward Oakwood Drive, Jack's mind churned with thoughts. He knew he was technically off duty, knew that there were probably protocols he should follow. But in that moment, none of that mattered. Eli needed help, and Jack wasn't about to let him down. When Jack pulled up to Eli's house, the same flickering porch light greeted him. The house looked even more run down than before, the weight of time pressing down on its sagging frame. Jack took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he might find inside. Eli opened the door before Jack could knock. The old man looked worse than Jack remembered, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow and filled with worry. His shoulders slumped as if the world had grown too heavy for him to carry. "Officer," Eli said, his voice hoarse, "thank you for coming." Jack nodded, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Of course, Eli. Let's take a look at Buddy, okay?" Eli stepped aside, and Jack entered the house. The oppressive warmth hit him again, but this time it felt even more suffocating. The smell of must and damp hung heavy in the air, along with something else. Something Jack couldn't quite place, but that sent a shiver down his spine. In the corner of the living room, on a threadbare blanket, lay Buddy. The old dog's breathing was labored, his eyes dull and unfocused. Jack knelt beside him, gently stroking his fur. He could feel the dog's ribs protruding beneath his hand, the unmistakable signs of malnutrition. "Eli," Jack said softly, glancing up at the old man who stood nearby, wringing his hands. "How long has Buddy been like this?" Eli sank into a nearby chair, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "It's been getting worse for a while," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying to take care of him, but it's hard. I didn't know what else to do." Jack nodded, his heart heavy. He could see now that this wasn't just about Buddy. It was about Eli, too. The old man had been struggling for a long time, sacrificing his own well-being to care for his dog, his last remaining connection to the world. "Eli," Jack began gently, "Buddy needs to see a vet, and frankly, you need to see a doctor, too. You've been pushing yourself too hard, trying to do everything on your own." Eli's hands trembled as he wiped at his eyes, his pride breaking down under the weight of his grief. "I know," he whispered. "I know it's foolish. But Buddy, he's all I've got left. I can't lose him, too." Jack felt a surge of admiration for the old man, even as his heart ached for him. Eli had been doing everything he could even when it was clear that he couldn't handle it alone. "It's not foolish to care," Jack said firmly, "but you don't have to do this alone anymore. Let me help you both." Eli looked up at Jack, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and doubt. He had spent so long relying on himself, so long believing that no one would be there for him. But now, Jack was offering something Eli hadn't had in years. A lifeline, a chance to be seen and cared for. "I don't know how to thank you," Eli whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Jack smiled softly, placing a hand on Eli's shoulder. "You don't have to thank me. This is what community is about. Looking out for each other." As Jack gently lifted Buddy into his arms, careful not to cause the dog any more discomfort, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come since that first night. What had started as a routine call about a suspected burglary had uncovered a far deeper, more devastating reality. One of isolation, poverty, and silent suffering. But as he carried Buddy out to his car, Eli following close behind, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, that helping Eli and Buddy wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to see it through. They had both been forgotten for too long. It was time for someone to remember. The sun had barely started its slow climb above the horizon by the time Jack pulled into the parking lot of the local vet. The small building was bathed in the early morning light, casting long shadows across the quiet street. Inside the car, the silence was palpable, broken only by the labored breathing of Buddy, who lay bundled in a blanket on the back seat. Eli sat beside Jack in the passenger seat, staring out the window. His usually proud and stoic expression was now softened by a mix of exhaustion and worry. Jack could see it in the way Eli's shoulders slumped, in the deep lines of his weathered face. He was tired, not just physically, but in the way only years of struggling could make a man tired. The two men hadn't exchanged many words since leaving Eli's house. There was no need. The weight of their shared concern for Buddy hung between them, thick and oppressive, but it also brought them together in a way that Jack hadn't anticipated. Jack had thought this was just about helping an old man in need, but now, it was something more. Eli had become more than just another call in the night. Jack found himself caring deeply, maybe more than he should. He wondered why. Was it because Eli reminded him of his father, who had passed away years ago? A man who had also refused to ask for help, too proud to lean on anyone, even when he was fighting a losing battle against time. Jack hadn't been there when his father died, and that guilt still haunted him. Perhaps Eli, in his stubborn pride and quiet desperation, was a chance for Jack to make things right in some way. Or maybe it was just that Jack saw in Eli a man who had been forgotten by a world that had moved on without him. And Jack knew, deep down, that Eli deserved better than that. As Jack cut the engine, Eli finally spoke, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. "I don't know what I'll do if Buddy doesn't make it." He didn't look at Jack, but the rawness in his voice was impossible to miss. Jack turned in his seat, studying the old man for a moment. Eli looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his worry. "We're going to do everything we can for him," Jack said, his voice steady. "Dr. Sinclair is one of the best vets in town. If anyone can help Buddy, it's her." Eli nodded, but didn't seem comforted by the words. His hand gripped the door handle as if preparing for the worst. "I know," he whispered, "but I've seen a lot of good folks taken down by things that were out of their control. It's hard to keep hoping when you've watched the world take everything from you, piece by piece." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. There was something so final, so resigned in Eli's words. This was a man who had lost so much. His wife, his health, and now, possibly, his only remaining companion. It was hard to imagine what it must feel like to face the prospect of losing the last bit of love and loyalty you have in the world. Jack opened his mouth to say something, anything, to reassure him, but Eli shook his head and opened the car door before Jack could speak. Inside the vet clinic, the smell of antiseptic and animal care products filled the air. A young receptionist greeted them with a sympathetic smile. "Officer Carter, we've been expecting you," she said, her eyes flickering toward Buddy, who lay limp in Jack's arms. "Dr. Sinclair is ready for you in the back." Jack nodded, and he and Eli followed the receptionist through a set of swinging doors into the back examination room. Dr. Sinclair, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and a calm, authoritative demeanor, was waiting for them. Her expression softened as she looked at Buddy. "Let's get him up on the table," she said gently. Jack carefully laid the old dog down, and Dr. Sinclair began her examination, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years tending to animals in all states of health. Eli stood at the edge of the room, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes never leaving Buddy. The silence in the room stretched on as Dr. Sinclair examined Buddy. Finally, she straightened up and turned to Jack and Eli, her expression serious but not without hope. "He's in rough shape," she said, her voice calm and professional. "Malnourished, severely dehydrated, and there are signs of age-related issues, arthritis, muscle loss. But the good news is that it's not too late. With proper care, nutrition, and hydration, I believe we can get him stable again." Eli let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You think he's going to make it?" There was an edge of desperation in his voice. Dr. Sinclair nodded. "I do. But he's going to need some intensive treatment for the next few days. I'll keep him here, monitor him closely, and start him on fluids. If everything goes well, he should pull through." Eli slumped against the wall, his relief palpable. Jack stepped forward, placing a hand on Eli's shoulder. "He's in good hands now," Jack said quietly. "We'll take it one step at a time." Dr. Sinclair began explaining the treatment plan in more detail, but Jack could see that Eli wasn't really listening. The relief of knowing that Buddy might be okay was already starting to give way to a deeper, more pervasive fear, one that went beyond the dog lying on the examination table. Jack could see it in the way Eli's shoulders tensed again, in the way his eyes drifted to the floor. He wasn't just worried about Buddy's future. He was worried about his own. As Dr. Sinclair finished outlining the treatment plan, Eli nodded numbly, barely responding. Jack thanked the vet and arranged to cover the costs of Buddy's care through an emergency fund for local veterans. Eli didn't protest this time, though Jack could tell it bothered him. Once they were back outside, standing in the cold morning air, Eli spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't helped," he admitted, his eyes focused on the ground. "I would have lost him. And then what? What's left for me after that?" Jack sighed, his breath visible in the chilly air. He wanted to tell Eli that everything would be fine, that things would get better, but he knew Eli had been hearing empty promises for too long. Instead, Jack said something else, something truer. "You're not alone, Eli. You don't have to keep doing this by yourself. We'll figure this out together." Eli didn't respond right away. He simply stood there, staring at the ground, his thoughts a million miles away. Jack knew it wasn't going to be easy to get Eli to accept help, but he was determined not to give up. "We'll come back in a few days to check on Buddy," Jack said, breaking the silence. "In the meantime, let's get you home. You've got to take care of yourself too, Eli." Eli nodded absently, following Jack back to the car. As they drove back to Eli's house, the weight of the situation settled over them both, heavy and unyielding. Jack's mind raced with thoughts about the house, the stove, the living conditions Eli was dealing with. He knew he had to do more, but the question was how. How do you help a man who's been failed so many times that he doesn't believe help exists anymore? As they pulled into Eli's driveway, Jack parked the car and turned to face him. "Eli," he said carefully, "you've got to let me help you. Not just with Buddy, but with everything. That house isn't safe, and you can't keep living like this." Eli's expression hardened. "I've been doing fine on my own for a long time, officer. I don't need anyone's pity." "It's not pity," Jack said, his voice firm but gentle. "It's about making sure you're okay, that you don't end up in a situation you can't get out of. You've been through enough. You don't need to keep struggling alone." Eli's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightening. Jack could see the battle playing out in the old man's mind, the pride, the years of having to rely on himself, the fear of what it might mean to ask for help. It was a fight Jack understood all too well. After a long moment, Eli finally spoke, his voice low and filled with weariness. "You want to help me, officer? Fine. But don't make promises you can't keep. I've heard enough of those to last me a lifetime." Jack nodded. "I won't make any promises I can't keep, Eli. You have my word." Eli said nothing more as he got out of the car and headed toward his house. Jack watched him go, a mixture of hope and uncertainty swirling inside him. He had taken the first step, but there was still a long road ahead. As Jack drove away, the image of Eli's weary figure lingered in his mind. He knew he couldn't fix everything overnight, but he was determined to do whatever it took to make sure Eli wasn't forgotten again. The days that followed felt like a blur to Jack. The demands of his job kept him busy, but his mind never strayed far from Eli and Buddy. Every time he had a spare moment, Jack found himself checking his phone, waiting for a call from the vet or from Eli. He had arranged for daily updates on Buddy's condition, and so far the news had been positive. The old dog was responding well to treatment, but there was still a long way to go. Meanwhile, Jack had made calls to social services and the local VA, pushing for someone to visit Eli's home and assess his living situation. But as usual, the system moved at a snail's pace. Jack knew that even with the best intentions, bureaucracy had a way of slowing things down to the point of ineffectiveness. Eli couldn't wait for the system to catch up with him. He needed help now. One evening, as Jack sat at his desk in the station going through the last of his paperwork, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from the vet. Buddy is doing better, gaining strength. You should bring Mr. Barnes by tomorrow to see him. Jack let out a sigh of relief. Buddy was pulling through, and that meant Eli would have something to hold on to, a reason to keep going. But as much as Jack was relieved about Buddy, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something weighing on Eli. It wasn't just about the dog. It was about the life Eli had been living for so long, a life of isolation, hardship, and fear. Jack closed his laptop and grabbed his coat. It was late, but he needed to check on Eli. Something had been gnawing at him ever since that night. Something about the way Eli had talked about not having any options, about being let down by promises that were never kept. Jack knew that feeling all too well, and it worried him. Eli had sounded like a man who had given up hope. As Jack pulled up to Eli's house, the flickering porch light greeted him once again, casting long shadows over the snow-covered lawn. Jack had driven a few times during his shifts, but Eli never seemed to be outside, and the curtains were always drawn. Tonight, though, something felt different, and almost eerie stillness hung in the air. Jack knocked on the door, waiting for the sound of Eli's slow footsteps approaching from the other side. But there was nothing. No movement, no shuffling, just silence. Jack's gut twisted. "Eli," Jack called out, knocking again, louder this time. "It's Jack Carter. You in there?" Still nothing. Jack's heart rate quickened. He knocked one more time, and when there was still no response, he tried the doorknob. To his surprise, it turned out easily. The door creaked open, and a wave of stifling heat hit Jack like a wall. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of a single lamp in the living room. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating. Jack stepped inside, his senses on high alert. "Eli?" he called out again, his voice tight with worry. It wasn't until he reached the living room that he saw him. Eli was slumped in his old armchair, his head resting against the back of the chair, his face pale and drawn. His breathing was shallow, and his eyes were closed. Jack's heart jumped into his throat. "Eli!" Jack rushed over, kneeling beside him, his hand immediately going to Eli's wrist, checking for a pulse. It was there, weak but steady there. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Eli, can you hear me?" Jack asked, gently shaking the old man's shoulder. Eli stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment he seemed disoriented, his gaze unfocused. "Jack?" he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. Jack exhaled in relief. "Yeah, it's me. What's going on, Eli? You're burning up in here." Eli's eyes drifted closed again, his voice faint. I don't know. I was just sitting here, and then I don't feel so good." Jack quickly scanned the room, his eyes landing on the stove in the kitchen. The burners were all on, pumping out heat into the already stifling room. Jack cursed under his breath and rushed to turn them off. The gas had been running for who knew how long, filling the house with fumes. It was a miracle Eli hadn't passed out entirely. Once the stove was off, Jack opened a few windows, letting the freezing night air pour in. The room instantly became more bearable, though the chill sent a shiver down Jack's spine. He hurried back to Eli, gently helping him to sit up. "You've been sitting in this heat for too long," Jack said, trying to keep his voice calm. "We need to get you checked out. Come on, let's get you out of here." Eli shook his head weakly, his eyes filled with a mix of confusion and embarrassment. I don't need a doctor," he mumbled, though even he didn't seem convinced by his own words. "Yes, you do," Jack said firmly. "You can't keep living like this, Eli. You're going to end up seriously hurt or worse." Eli's head dropped, his breath coming in shallow gasps. I don't know what to do anymore, Jack. I'm so tired. Tired of trying. Tired of everything." Jack felt a pang in his chest. Eli's words hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was something deeper, something that had been festering inside Eli for years. It was the kind of weariness that came from being beaten down over and over again by life. "You're not alone," Jack said quietly. "I know it feels like you are, but you're not. We're going to figure this out, Eli, but first I need to get you to a doctor, okay?" Eli didn't argue this time. He didn't have the strength to. Jack helped him to his feet, and together they slowly made their way to the door. As they stepped outside, the cold air hit them, sharp and biting, but Jack welcomed it. It was a relief from the oppressive heat of the house, a reminder that there was still life beyond those four walls. Jack helped Eli into the passenger seat of his car, making sure he was settled before closing the door. As he walked around to the driver's side, Jack took a deep breath, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This was worse than he'd thought. Eli wasn't just physically struggling, he was hanging on by a thread, and Jack wasn't sure how long that thread would hold. But one thing was clear: Eli needed help, and Jack wasn't going to let him slip through the cracks again. The drive to the hospital was silent, but the weight of Eli's words hung heavy in the air. Jack kept glancing over at the old man, slumped in the passenger seat, his face pale and lined with exhaustion. Eli's breathing had steadied since they left his house, but Jack could see the toll life had taken on him. It wasn't just the physical wear and tear of age, it was something deeper, a weariness that had settled into his bones, a weariness that comes from years of isolation and hardship. As they pulled up to the emergency room entrance, Jack's thoughts raced. Eli had opened up to him in a way Jack hadn't expected. The old man's admission, "I don't know what to do anymore," was a cry for help, one that Jack wasn't about to ignore. But this went far beyond fixing a broken furnace or feeding an old dog. Eli was crumbling under the weight of his own pride, his past, and the system that had failed him. Jack parked and helped Eli out of the car. The cold night air bit at their faces, but Eli didn't complain. His steps were slow and unsteady, and Jack had to keep a firm hand on his arm to guide him inside. Once they reached the check-in desk, Jack explained Eli's situation to the nurse on duty. She glanced over at Eli, her expression softening as she took in his frail state. "We'll get him looked at right away," she said, her voice kind but professional. "Please fill out these forms, officer." Jack nodded and guided Eli to a chair. As the nurse took Eli's vitals, Jack settled in beside him and began filling out the paperwork. The mundane task gave Jack a moment to think. He knew this wasn't just a one-time crisis. Getting Eli the medical attention he needed was only the beginning. There were deeper wounds to heal, wounds that had been festering for years. "Eli," Jack said after a moment, his voice low, "this is just the first step, okay? After we get you checked out, we need to figure out how to get things under control. I know you've been doing your best, but it's time to let someone help you." Eli didn't respond at first. He just stared at the floor, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. Jack could see the struggle in his eyes, the fight between pride and the undeniable reality of his situation. Finally, Eli spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been on my own for so long," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "Margaret's been gone for over 20 years now, and since then, it's just been me and Buddy. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could make do. But everything's gotten so much harder. I didn't want to admit I needed help." Jack placed a hand on Eli's shoulder. "There's no shame in asking for help. You've carried the weight for a long time, Eli. But you don't have to do it alone anymore." Eli's eyes flicked toward Jack, a flicker of something, hope, maybe, crossing his tired face. But just as quickly, it was gone. "I don't know how to let go," Eli muttered. "Everything I've got left is tied up in that house. It's all I have." Jack nodded, understanding the depth of Eli's attachment to his home. "We're not talking about giving up your home, Eli. We're talking about making sure it's a place where you can live safely. You shouldn't have to worry about freezing in the winter or heating your house with a gas stove. We can fix this, but you've got to let us help." Before Eli could respond, a nurse approached with a wheelchair. "Mr. Barnes, we're ready to take you back for some tests," she said, her tone gentle. "Officer Carter, you're welcome to wait in the lobby." Eli gave Jack a long, tired look before nodding and allowing the nurse to help him into the wheelchair. Jack watched as they wheeled Eli away, the old man's frail frame seeming smaller with each step. Jack felt a familiar pang of frustration at the world that had let Eli slip through the cracks, frustration at the system that moved too slowly to catch people like him before it was too late. Jack sat down in the waiting area, running a hand over his face. He knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but he was determined to see this through. Eli wasn't just another call, another case to close. He was a man who had given everything he had to his country, only to be forgotten in the end. Jack wouldn't let him be forgotten again. Hours passed in the sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting room. Jack shifted in his seat, unable to shake the knot of tension in his chest. He kept replaying Eli's words in his head. "I didn't want to admit I needed help." How many people like Eli were out there struggling in silence, too proud or too afraid to ask for help? Jack had seen it before. Pride could be a powerful thing, especially for men like Eli who had built their lives on self-reliance. But pride could also be dangerous. It could keep a person from accepting the help they desperately needed until it was too late. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the nurse reappeared. "Officer Carter," she called, gesturing for Jack to follow her. Jack stood and followed her down the sterile hallway to a small examination room. Inside, Eli was sitting up in a hospital bed, looking slightly more alert than before but still worn out. Jack felt a sense of relief wash over him. "The doctor wants to keep him here for a few more tests," the nurse explained. "But it looks like he's stable for now. He was dehydrated and there's some concern about his blood pressure, but we're monitoring him closely." Jack nodded. "Thank you. I appreciate everything you're doing for him." The nurse smiled and left the room, leaving Jack and Eli alone. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jack could tell Eli was still grappling with everything that had happened. He looked smaller in the hospital bed, his once strong frame now fragile and diminished by age and hardship. "I guess I wasn't doing as fine as I thought," Eli said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, but there was a trace of something new in it, an acceptance of sorts. Jack pulled up a chair beside the bed. "You've been doing the best you can, Eli, but you don't have to keep carrying it all by yourself." Eli nodded slowly, his gaze distant. I thought if I asked for help, it meant I was weak, but I'm starting to see that maybe it's the opposite." Jack smiled slightly. "Asking for help takes strength. It's not easy, especially when you've been doing it on your own for so long. Eli's hand rested on the thin blanket, trembling slightly. I don't even know where to start, Jack. Everything feels like it's falling apart. You don't have to figure it all out tonight, Jack said gently. We'll take it one step at a time. First, we get you healthy. Then, we'll figure out how to get your house fixed up, and we'll make sure you've got the support you need. You've got people who care about you, Eli. You're not alone in this. Eli looked up at Jack, and for the first time since that night they'd met, there was something different in his eyes. It wasn't quite hope, but it was close. Closer than it had been in a long time. I don't know why you're doing all this for me, Eli said, his voice tinged with disbelief. I'm just an old man. I'm not anybody important. Jack shook his head, his voice firm. You're important, Eli. You've got a life that matters, you've got stories that matter, you've served your country, and you've survived things most people can't even imagine. That's worth something. Don't ever think you don't matter. Eli didn't respond right away, but Jack could see the words sinking in. The silence between them felt heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two men who understood the weight of life and the importance of human connection. After a few minutes, Eli spoke again, his voice soft but resolute. You really think things can get better? Jack met Eli's gaze, his expression serious but filled with quiet determination. I know they can. It won't be easy, but we'll figure it out. Together. Eli nodded, and for the first time in a long time, Jack saw a glimmer of belief in the old man's eyes. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Jack juggled his shifts at the station with visits to the hospital, checking in on Eli and making sure he was getting the care he needed. Buddy, too, was on the mend, thanks to the efforts of the vet. Every time Jack visited Eli, he brought an update about Buddy's condition, and each time he saw a little more light return to the old man's eyes. It wasn't just about the dog. It was about what Buddy represented. He was Eli's last connection to a life that had slowly crumbled away over the years. Jack knew that if Buddy had pulled through, it would be a turning point for Eli, a sign that things could get better. But Jack also knew that Buddy's recovery was only part of the solution. Eli needed more than just his dog back. He needed a safe place to live, a support system, and access to the resources that had been out of reach for so long. Jack had been working behind the scenes to set all of that in motion, but he was careful not to overwhelm Eli with too much information too soon. One step at a time, Jack reminded himself. Eli needed to feel like he still had control, like he was an active participant in his own recovery. On the third day, Jack received a call from the hospital. Eli was being discharged. Jack picked him up that afternoon. As they drove back to Eli's house, the mood in the car was lighter than it had been in weeks. Eli still looked tired, but there was quiet determination in his posture, a willingness to keep moving forward. You've been through a lot, Eli, Jack said as they turned onto Oakwood Drive. But you're still here. That counts for something. Eli nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. I've got a lot to figure out, he admitted. But I'm ready to start trying. As they pulled up in front of Eli's house, Jack noticed something different. A few cars were parked along the street and there were people gathered in the yard. Familiar faces from the community. Eli's neighbors had come together, and in the days that Eli had been in the hospital, they'd started cleaning up the yard, clearing away the overgrown bushes, and fixing the sagging porch. Eli stared at the scene in disbelief. What is all this? Jack smiled, placing a hand on Eli's shoulder. I told you, you're not alone. People care, Eli. Your story matters to them. As they got out of the car, one of Eli's neighbors, Tom Henderson, approached with a warm smile. Eli, good to see you up and about, Tom said, shaking Eli's hand. We heard about what happened and we thought we'd pitch in. You've been a part of this town for a long time, and we wanted to give back. Eli blinked, his eyes misting over as he looked around at the people working in his yard. I don't know what to say, he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Tom replied with a grin. "We're just glad to help." Jack watched as Eli slowly walked toward the house, his hand trailing along the freshly repaired porch railing. For a moment, Jack thought Eli might break down, but instead the old man straightened his shoulders, his pride giving way to gratitude. "I didn't think people cared anymore," Eli said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was forgotten." "You're not forgotten, Eli," Jack said quietly. "You never were." Eli nodded, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. He looked at Jack, then back at his neighbors, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you all." The work continued over the next few hours, with more volunteers arriving to help. The house that had once stood as a symbol of Eli's isolation was now being transformed, bit by bit, into a place of hope. As the sun began to set, Jack and Eli sat on the newly repaired porch, watching the last of the volunteers pack up their tools and head home. The yard, once overgrown and neglected, now looked cared for, as though it had been given a new lease on life. "You've got a good group of people around you," Jack said, glancing over at Eli. "You're not in this alone." Eli smiled faintly, his eyes tired but content. "I don't know how I ended up so lucky," he murmured. "After everything, I didn't think I deserved any of this." Jack shook his head. "This isn't about deserving, Eli. It's about people caring, and they do." As they sat in the fading light, a comfortable silence settled between them. Jack knew that there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were on the right path. "Buddy's coming home in a few days," Jack said after a moment, breaking the silence. Eli's face lit up, and for the first time since Jack had met him, the old man let out a quiet laugh. "Good," Eli said, his voice lighter than it had been in weeks. "It'll be good to have him back." Jack smiled, knowing that Eli's journey was far from over, but also knowing that the worst of the storm had passed. There was still work to be done, but for now, they could rest, knowing that they weren't fighting the battle alone. The day Buddy came home should have been a happy one, but as Jack and Eli pulled into the driveway of Eli's house, the air felt heavy with unspoken tension. Eli's face was tight with emotion, and Jack knew the old man was trying to keep his feelings in check. Buddy's recovery was a huge victory, but the weight of everything else in Eli's life still loomed large. His health, his home, his sense of self-worth. Jack could feel the strain, as if Eli was balancing on a knife's edge. Dr. Sinclair had advised Eli to take it slow with Buddy. The old dog was better, but he wasn't the same spry companion he once was. Jack worried how Eli would handle that. So much of Eli's strength came from taking care of Buddy, and now that role was shifting. Jack wondered if Eli could cope with the changes, or if this would be the breaking point that sent him back into isolation. Jack got out of the car and opened the back door, where Buddy lay on a soft blanket. The old dog looked up at him with tired, trusting eyes, his tail giving a weak wag. Jack smiled, gently lifting him into his arms. Buddy was lighter than Jack remembered, and the feel of his ribs beneath his fur was a painful reminder of how close they had come to losing him. Eli climbed out of the car slowly, his eyes fixed on Buddy. There was a mix of relief and sadness in his gaze. Relief that Buddy was coming home, but sadness that the dog's decline was so evident. Eli had always taken pride in being able to care for his faithful companion, and now that Buddy was fragile, it only reinforced Eli's own sense of vulnerability. As they walked up the newly repaired porch, Jack felt the tension building between them. Eli hadn't said much since they left the vet, and Jack could tell he was holding something back. "Let's get Buddy settled," Jack said gently as he carried the dog into the house. Inside, the air was cool and fresh. Tom Henderson and the other volunteers had fixed the furnace, and the gas stove was no longer Eli's only source of heat. The house felt different now, more welcoming, but Jack knew that it would take more than repairs to lift the weight Eli carried inside. Jack set Buddy down on a soft dog bed that had been placed in the corner of the living room. The dog curled up immediately, letting out a deep, contented sigh. For a moment, everything seemed calm, but the quiet didn't last. Eli stood in the middle of the room, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. Jack could see the tension radiating off him, the worry, the guilt, the overwhelming sense of helplessness. And then, as if a dam had finally broken, Eli spoke. "I failed him," Eli said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I failed Buddy. He got sick because of me. I couldn't take care of him. I couldn't even take care of myself." Jack froze, the weight of Eli's words hanging in the air like a thick fog. He had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Eli to reach the point where he could no longer keep everything inside. But hearing it, seeing the pain on Eli's face, was harder than Jack had anticipated. "Eli," Jack began softly, stepping toward him. "You didn't fail anyone. You did the best you could with what you had." Eli shook his head, his eyes welling with tears. "The best I could wasn't enough. Look at me, Jack. I'm falling apart. My house, my health. Buddy, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I thought I could handle it, but I can't. I can't even take care of the one thing that matters most to me." Jack placed a hand on Eli's shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. "Eli, listen to me. You've been through hell and back. No one expects you to do this all by yourself. You're not a failure for needing help." Eli's body trembled under the weight of his emotions, and for a moment, Jack thought he might break down completely. But instead, Eli's face hardened, his jaw clenching as he fought back the tears. "I don't know how to ask for help," he said, his voice rough with frustration. "I've spent my whole life trying to be strong, trying to be the man Margaret would have been proud of. But now I don't even know who I am anymore." Jack swallowed hard, feeling the full weight of Eli's confession. This was the moment he had been preparing for. The moment when Eli would either open up fully or retreat into himself forever. Jack knew he had to tread carefully. "You're still that man," Jack said quietly. "You're still the man who loves his wife, who fought for his country, who took care of Buddy when no one else was there. None of that changes because you need help now. Needing help doesn't make you weak, Eli. It makes you human." Eli's shoulders slumped, and for a long moment, the room was silent. Jack could see the internal struggle playing out in Eli's mind. The battle between his pride and the deep-seated need for connection, for support. Jack waited, knowing that this was a decision Eli had to make for himself. Finally, Eli let out a shaky breath and sank down into the worn armchair beside Buddy. His hand reached out to rest on the dog's head, his fingers trembling slightly. "I don't know how to do this," Eli whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "I don't know how to stop pretending that I can do it all on my own." Jack sat down across from him, keeping his tone gentle but firm. "You don't have to pretend anymore, Eli. I'm here, and so is everyone else. Your neighbors, the people who came out to help fix your house, they all care about you. You've got a community that's willing to stand by you. All you have to do is let them in." Eli didn't respond right away. His gaze was fixed on Buddy, who was resting peacefully beside him, his breathing slow and steady. For the first time in a long time, Eli wasn't alone. "I don't know if I can," Eli finally admitted, his voice barely audible. "But I'll try." Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't a full acceptance of help, but it was a start. And that was all Jack needed, a small step in the right direction. "That's all anyone can ask," Jack said, giving Eli a reassuring smile. "We'll take it one day at a time." Eli nodded, though Jack could see that the old man was still grappling with his feelings. There was a long road ahead, and Jack knew there would be more moments like this. Moments when Eli's pride and his need for independence would clash with the reality of his situation. But Jack was ready to face those challenges with him. He wasn't going anywhere. As the evening wore on, Jack stayed with Eli, talking quietly about the future, about the repairs that still needed to be done on the house, about the next steps in getting Eli the support he needed. Jack could see the weariness in Eli's eyes, but he could also see something else, a glimmer of hope that hadn't been there before. Buddy stirred in his bed, his tail giving a faint thump against the floor as if sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Eli smiled down at him, and for the first time in weeks, Jack saw a hint of the man Eli used to be, a man who, despite everything, still had the strength to keep going. By the time Jack left that night, the house felt different. It wasn't just the repairs or the fresh air. It was the sense of possibility, the knowledge that things could get better. Eli still had a long way to go, but for the first time he wasn't walking the path alone. 2 weeks passed, and Eli slowly began to settle into a new routine. Jack continued to visit him regularly, checking in on both Eli and Buddy. The house had undergone more repairs, thanks to the volunteers who had rallied around Eli, and it was starting to feel like a real home again. But while the physical improvements were evident, Jack could see that Eli was still struggling emotionally. Buddy, though stronger, wasn't the same dog he used to be. He moved more slowly, his once boundless energy now reduced to brief spurts of activity before he tired out. Eli spent most of his time sitting with Buddy, watching him closely, as if afraid that at any moment he might lose him. Jack worried about Eli's attachment to Buddy. It wasn't just that Eli loved the dog. Buddy was Eli's lifeline, the one thing tethering him to the world. Jack knew that if something happened to Buddy, Eli might not be able to handle it, and that fear was always lurking at the back of Jack's mind. One cold morning, Jack received a call from Eli. The moment he heard the old man's voice, he knew something was wrong. "Jack," Eli's voice cracked on the other end of the line. "It's Buddy. He's not doing well." Jack's heart sank. "I'll be right over," he said, already grabbing his jacket. The drive to Eli's house felt longer than usual, the anxiety building with every passing minute. When Jack arrived, Eli was waiting on the porch, his face pale and his eyes rimmed red. Jack didn't need to ask what was wrong. He could see the answer in Eli's expression. Buddy lay on his bed in the living room, his breathing shallow and labored. The once strong dog was now barely holding on, and Jack could see the pain in his eyes. Eli knelt beside him, his hand resting on Buddy's side, his face tight with grief. "I don't know what to do," Eli whispered, his voice breaking. "He's in so much pain, Jack. I can't watch him suffer like this." Jack knelt beside him, placing a hand on Eli's shoulder. "It's okay, Eli," Jack said softly. "You've done everything you could for him. You've given him a good life." Eli's eyes filled with tears as he looked down at Buddy. "I don't want to let him go," he choked out, "but I don't want him to hurt anymore." Jack's chest tightened with emotion. He knew what Eli was going through. It was the hardest decision a pet owner could ever make. Buddy had been more than just a dog to Eli. He had been a companion, a source of unconditional love in a world that had often seemed indifferent to Eli's struggles. "I'll call Dr. Sinclair," Jack said quietly. "She'll come over and help." Eli didn't respond. He just nodded, his hand never leaving Buddy's side. As Jack made the call, his heart ached for Eli. He knew how much this loss would devastate the old man. Buddy had been Eli's constant, the one thing that had kept him going when everything else had fallen apart. Without Buddy, Jack feared that Eli might fall back into the deep well of despair he had only just begun to climb out of. Dr. Sinclair arrived within the hour. She was gentle and compassionate, explaining the process to Eli as she prepared to help Buddy pass peacefully. Eli stayed beside his dog the entire time, whispering soft words of love and reassurance as Buddy's breathing slowed. And then, with one final sigh, Buddy was gone. Eli's grief was immediate and overwhelming. He clung to Buddy's still body, his shoulders shaking with sobs. Jack stayed close by, his own heart breaking for the man who had already lost so much. When it was over, Jack helped Eli bury Buddy in the backyard, under a tree where the dog had loved to lie in the summer. The two men worked in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. As they finished, Eli stood over the freshly dug grave, his face etched with sorrow. "He was all I had left," Eli whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't know what to do now." Jack placed a hand on Eli's shoulder, his voice steady, but filled with empathy. "You don't have to figure it out today, Eli. You've been through a lot. But you're not alone in this. You've got me, and you've got people who care about you. We'll get through this together." Eli didn't respond right away. He just stood there, staring down at Buddy's grave, his grief too deep for words. Jack stayed with him, offering silent support as Eli began to process the loss of his faithful companion. The sun had started to set by the time they headed back inside. The house felt emptier now, the absence of Buddy a stark reminder of the fragility of life. Jack knew that the days ahead would be hard for Eli, but he also knew that the old man had strength left in him, strength that Jack would help him find again. The days following Buddy's death were some of the hardest Jack had ever seen Eli go through. The old man retreated into himself, barely speaking, barely eating. Jack visited every day, but each time he found Eli sitting in the same spot in his worn armchair, staring out the window at the small grave beneath the tree. The house, which had felt so full of potential just weeks earlier, now felt heavy with grief, as though Buddy's passing had sucked all the life out of it. Jack had known this moment would come, the breaking point that Eli had been teetering on for so long. Without Buddy, the old man seemed lost, untethered. Jack worried that Eli might spiral further into depression, shutting everyone out again. The flicker of hope that had begun to grow in Eli was now in danger of being snuffed out for good. But Jack wasn't about to let that happen. He knew Eli had more fight left in him, even if the old man didn't realize it yet. One afternoon, about a week after Buddy's passing, Jack drove up to Eli's house as usual. He had been giving Eli space to grieve, but today felt different. Today, Jack was determined to pull Eli out of the darkness, no matter how much resistance he faced. Jack knew from experience that grief, left unchecked, could consume a person whole, and he wasn't about to let Eli disappear. Jack knocked on the door and waited, hearing the slow shuffle of Eli's footsteps inside. When the door creaked open, Eli stood there, looking as tired and worn as ever. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt, and Jack could tell he hadn't slept well in days. "Morning, Eli," Jack said, his tone gentle but firm. "I thought we could get out of the house for a bit. Take a drive. Maybe grab some coffee." Eli shook his head, his voice rough. "Not today, Jack. I'm just not up for it." Jack stepped forward, refusing to let Eli shut him out. "I know you're hurting, Eli. I know how much Buddy meant to you, but sitting here, alone, day after day, it's not helping. Let's get some air. Clear your head a little." Eli stared at the floor, his body sagging with the weight of his grief. Jack could see the battle playing out inside him. Eli wanted to stay in his cocoon of sorrow, but deep down, he knew Jack was right. Finally, with a long, heavy sigh, Eli nodded. "All right," he muttered. "But just for a little while." Jack smiled, relieved that he had gotten through to him. "That's all I'm asking." They drove in silence for a while, the landscape of Harper's Ridge passing by in a blur of bare trees and frost-covered fields. The town was small and quiet, but it held a certain charm, one that Jack had come to appreciate over the years. He glanced over at Eli, who was staring out the window, lost in thought. After a while, Jack pulled into the parking lot of a small diner on the edge of town. It was a local spot, one of those places where everyone knew each other, and Jack hoped the familiarity might offer some comfort to Eli. As they stepped inside, the warm scent of coffee and pancakes filled the air, and the murmur of quiet conversation surrounded them. They sat at a booth near the window, and after they ordered, Jack finally broke the silence. "I know it feels like the world's stopped turning," Jack said, his voice low. Losing Buddy. It's a kind of pain that runs deep. But you've still got a life to live, Eli. You've still got a lot left in you." Eli didn't respond right away. His eyes were fixed on the mug of coffee in front of him, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the cup. "I don't know how to move forward, Jack," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Buddy was all I had. Now it's just empty." Jack leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You've lost a lot, Eli. But you haven't lost everything. You've got people who care about you, people who want to help you if you'll let them. Your life doesn't have to be empty." Eli shook his head slowly, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "It's hard to believe that sometimes. I spent so long thinking I could do it all on my own. But now, I don't even know who I am without Buddy, without Margaret, without the things that made my life worth something." Jack reached across the table, placing a hand on Eli's arm. "You're still Eli Barnes. You're still the man who fought for this country, who built a life with the woman he loved. None of that changes because you're going through a hard time. You've got more strength in you than you realize." Eli's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment, he seemed on the verge of breaking down again. But instead of retreating into himself, as Jack had feared he would, Eli sighed and nodded. "I don't want to be alone anymore," Eli said quietly. "I don't want to shut people out." Jack smiled, a wave of relief washing over him. "That's a start, Eli. That's all it takes." As they ate their meal, the conversation flowed more easily. Jack kept things light, talking about the goings-on around town, the repairs that had been done on Eli's house, and the veterans group that had been asking about him. Slowly, Eli began to engage, asking questions, even sharing a few stories about his time in the service. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind Jack that the old Eli was still in there, buried beneath the layers of grief and pain. After breakfast, Jack drove Eli home. But instead of dropping him off, Jack parked and turned to him. "I've been thinking about something," Jack said carefully. "There's a veterans group that meets down at the community center every Thursday. They've got a lot of guys who've been through similar things, losing loved ones, dealing with the weight of the past. I think it might do you some good to check it out." Eli frowned, his initial reaction one of hesitation. "I don't know, Jack. I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "I get it," Jack said, "but it doesn't have to be today or tomorrow. Just think about it. These guys know what it's like to feel lost, and they've found ways to keep moving forward. I think you might find some strength in talking to them." Eli was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the yard as if searching for an answer. Finally, he nodded. "Maybe," he said, though his voice was filled with uncertainty. "That's all I'm asking," Jack said with a reassuring smile. "Just keep it in mind." As Eli climbed out of the car and headed inside, Jack felt a small glimmer of hope. Eli was starting to open up, starting to let go of the isolation that had defined him for so long. It was a slow process, but Jack could see the change in him, a willingness to try, even if it was just a small step. A few days later, Jack received a call from Tom Henderson. Tom was one of the volunteers who had helped repair Eli's house, and he had been keeping an eye on the place ever since. Jack had asked Tom to stop by now and then, just to make sure Eli wasn't slipping back into his old habits of isolation. "Hey, Jack," Tom said, his voice upbeat. "I just wanted to let you know. I saw Eli down at the park today. He was sitting with some of the guys from the veterans group." Jack's heart lifted. "Really? How'd he seem?" "He looked good," Tom replied. "Still quiet, but they were talking. I think it's doing him some good." Jack smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. "Thanks for letting me know, Tom. I appreciate it." After hanging up, Jack leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the last few weeks finally start to lift. Eli was finding his way back, slowly but surely. It wasn't a straight path, and there were still plenty of rough days ahead, but the fact that Eli had taken that step, had reached out to others who understood his pain, was more than Jack could have hoped for. Jack knew that grief was a long and winding road, but he also knew that Eli wasn't walking it alone anymore. The community had rallied around him, and Jack had seen firsthand how much strength could come from the simple act of reaching out. A week later, Jack drove over to Eli's house. It had been a little while since he last visited, and he wanted to check in, make sure things were still on the right track. When he arrived, he found Eli sitting on the porch, a warm blanket draped over his lap and a small contented smile on his face. "Jack," Eli greeted him as he climbed the steps. "Good to see you." "You too, Eli," Jack replied, taking a seat beside him. "How've you been?" Eli sighed, but it was the kind of sigh that carried with it a sense of peace. "I've been better," he admitted. "I've been talking to some of the guys from the veterans group. It's been good for me. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear other people's stories." Jack nodded, a warm smile spreading across his face. "I'm glad to hear that." Eli looked out at the yard, his eyes thoughtful. "I still miss him," he said, his voice quiet. "Buddy, I don't think that'll ever go away." "You don't have to stop missing him," Jack said gently. "Buddy was family. That kind of loss stays with you. But you're not alone in that grief anymore. And that's what makes the difference." Eli nodded, his eyes softening as he let Jack's words sink in. "You've been good to me, Jack," Eli said after a moment. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to thank me, Eli," Jack replied. "This is what community is for, being there for each other." Eli smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "I didn't think I'd ever feel like I belonged anywhere again. But you were right. I'm not alone." As they sat together on the porch, watching the last of the autumn leaves fall from the trees, Jack felt a sense of calm settle over him. The journey had been long and painful, but Eli had made it through the worst of the storm. There would still be hard days, but Jack knew that Eli had found his way back to life, back to the people who cared about him. And as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the yard, Jack couldn't help but feel grateful for the second chances, for the strength of community, and for the enduring power of human connection. Winter settled over Harper's Ridge, casting the town in a blanket of white. The cold air was sharp but clean, and Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose as he drove through the familiar streets. It had been 2 months since Buddy's passing, and though Eli still had his bad days, there was a noticeable shift in his outlook on life. The veterans group had become a lifeline for him, a place where he could share his grief, find companionship, and rediscover a sense of belonging. But more than that, Eli had started letting people in again. His neighbors, many of whom had helped repair his house, continued to check in on him. Tom Henderson stopped by regularly, bringing over groceries or sitting with Eli on the porch to talk about old times. Eli's home, once a symbol of isolation and neglect, had become a gathering place for those who cared about him. Jack had never been more proud. One cold evening, as Jack sat in his small apartment, sipping a cup of coffee, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Tom. "You should come by Eli's place tomorrow. Got a surprise for him." Intrigued, Jack texted back, "What kind of surprise?" "Just come by and see for yourself," Tom replied, followed by a winking emoji. The next morning, Jack bundled up and drove over to Eli's house. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw a small crowd gathered outside. There were familiar faces: Tom, some of the other volunteers, and even a few of the veterans from Eli's group. They were standing in a loose circle around something Jack couldn't quite see yet. Eli was on the porch, looking bewildered but smiling, a rare sight that immediately warmed Jack's heart. As Jack stepped out of his car and approached the group, Tom waved him over. "Glad you could make it, Jack," Tom said, clapping him on the back. "We've got something special for Eli." Jack's curiosity was piqued. He stepped forward to get a better look at what everyone was gathered around, and that's when he saw it. A puppy. a small, golden-furred ball of energy bouncing around the legs of the crowd, tail wagging furiously. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he realized what was happening. Tom grinned, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "Meet Rex," he said, nodding toward the playful puppy. "We figured Eli could use a new friend." Jack's heart swelled with emotion as he glanced over at Eli, who was still sitting on the porch, watching the scene with a mixture of shock and joy. Jack approached him slowly, crouching down beside the older man. "You knew about this?" Eli asked, his voice filled with wonder. Jack shook his head, smiling. "I had no idea, but it seems like they've been planning this for a while." Eli's eyes were glued to the puppy, who was now playfully tugging on Tom's shoelaces. "I don't know what to say," Eli whispered. It's too much." "It's not too much," Jack said, his voice soft but firm. "You've been through a lot, Eli, and no one's trying to replace Buddy. Rex is just a new chapter, a chance to keep moving forward." For a moment, Eli was silent, his gaze still locked on the puppy. Jack could see the emotions swirling behind his eyes. The love he still carried for Buddy, the grief he hadn't fully let go of, and the hesitant hope that maybe, just maybe, he could open his heart again. "I'm not sure I'm ready for this," Eli said quietly, though Jack could hear the uncertainty giving way to something else. Something softer, more hopeful. "No one's ever really ready," Jack replied, placing a hand on Eli's shoulder. "But that's the thing about life, it keeps going, and we keep going with it." Eli took a deep breath, and then, slowly, he stood up. The crowd parted as he walked toward Rex, who immediately bounded over to him, tail wagging furiously. Eli knelt down, his movements slow and careful, and extended a hand toward the puppy. Rex sniffed Eli's hand curiously, then licked his fingers, his little body wiggling with excitement. A soft, quiet laugh escaped Eli's lips, and Jack felt his chest tighten with emotion. For the first time in what felt like forever, Eli was smiling, really smiling. The crowd around them cheered quietly, giving Eli the space to connect with his new companion. Tom stepped forward, beaming. "We figured you could use a little more company around here," he said. "Rex here is from a local shelter. He's got a lot of love to give." Eli looked up, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All of you. I don't know how to repay this." "You don't have to," Tom replied with a grin. "Just enjoy it." Jack watched as Eli stood up, cradling the puppy in his arms. Rex squirmed happily, licking Eli's face, and the sight of it brought tears to Jack's eyes. This was the culmination of everything they had worked toward, helping Eli heal, helping him find his way back to life. As the crowd dispersed, Eli sat back down on the porch with Rex in his lap. Jack joined him, the two of them sitting in comfortable silence as the puppy dozed off, nestled against Eli's chest. "He's a handful," Eli said after a while, his voice soft but filled with affection. "Yeah, but I think you're up for it," Jack replied with a smile. "Besides, Rex is lucky to have you." Eli nodded, stroking the puppy's fur. "I didn't think I'd ever have this again," he admitted quietly. "But maybe I can learn to love something new." Jack's heart swelled with pride. "You already have, Eli." The two men sat together on the porch, watching the world go by. The snow had started to fall again, soft flakes drifting down like tiny reminders that life, in all its beauty and pain, kept moving forward. And Eli, for the first time in a long time, was moving forward with it. In the weeks that followed, Eli's life slowly began to change. Rex brought new energy into the house, and with him came new routines, morning walks, afternoons spent playing in the yard, evenings curled up by the fire. The little puppy, with his boundless energy and unconditional love, became a source of light in Eli's life, filling the space that had once felt so empty. Eli's transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was steady and sure. He began taking better care of himself, eating regular meals, attending the veterans' meetings regularly, and even accepting help when it was offered. The walls he had built up over the years, the walls of pride and self-reliance, were slowly coming down. And through it all, Jack was there, watching with a quiet sense of pride. He saw how Eli began to reconnect with the people around him, how he started to open up in ways Jack had never thought possible. There were still hard days, of course, days when the weight of grief and loss threatened to pull Eli back into the darkness. But now, Eli had something to hold on to. He had Rex, he had his neighbors, and most importantly, he had hope. One crisp morning, Jack stopped by Eli's house for their usual coffee on the porch. As he approached, he saw Eli and Rex playing in the yard. The puppy was chasing a stick that Eli kept throwing, bounding through the snow with unbridled joy. Eli spotted Jack and waved him over. "Morning, Jack," he called, his voice full of energy. "You're just in time. Rex is wearing me out." Jack grinned as he walked over to join them. "Looks like he's keeping you busy." "Busy is good," Eli replied, tossing the stick again for Rex to chase. "Keeps me from sitting around feeling sorry for myself." They sat down on the porch, sipping their coffee as Rex played in the yard. Jack could see the difference in Eli. The spark in his eyes, the way his posture had straightened, the subtle joy that had returned to his life. "How's the veterans group going?" Jack asked after a while. Eli nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's been good. I've been going every week. There's something about being around people who understand, you know. I didn't think I needed that, but I do. It helps." Jack was glad to hear it. He knew how important it was for Eli to have that support system, especially as he continued to navigate his grief. "I'm proud of you, Eli," Jack said, his voice sincere. "You've come a long way." Eli glanced over at him, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "I wouldn't have made it this far without you, Jack. You never gave up on me, even when I tried to push you away." Jack shrugged, his smile soft. "That's what friends do." Eli chuckled softly. "Friends. I haven't had many of those in a long time, but I'm glad to have one now." The two men sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as Rex continued to romp through the snow, his little body full of life and energy. Jack felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. This, right here, was what it was all about. The quiet moments of connection, the understanding that no one had to walk their path alone. After a while, Eli spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "I've been thinking about getting more involved with the veterans group," he said. "Maybe helping out with some of the guys who are struggling the way I was. I think I could be good at that." Jack smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "You'd be great at that, Eli. You know what it's like to be in their shoes. You've got a lot to offer." Eli nodded, a quiet determination settling over him. "Yeah, I think I'm ready to give back. It's time to stop looking backward and start moving forward." Jack couldn't have agreed more. Eli had come so far, and now he was ready to help others in the same way he had been helped. It was a full circle moment. Eli, who had once been lost in his own grief and isolation, was now stepping up to guide others through their struggles. It was a reminder to Jack of why he had become a cop in the first place. It wasn't about the badges or the uniforms. It was about people. It was about helping one another, lifting each other up when the world seemed too heavy to bear alone. The two men spent the rest of the morning talking and laughing, sharing stories and memories. Jack felt lighter than he had in a long time, knowing that Eli was on a path of healing, a path that he had chosen for himself. As the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Jack stood to leave. "I'll see you next week," he said, clapping Eli on the shoulder. "Keep me posted on that veterans group." "You bet," Eli replied, smiling warmly. "And thanks again, Jack, for everything." Jack nodded, his heart full. "You don't have to thank me. Just keep moving forward." As Jack drove away, the sight of Eli and Rex playing in the yard lingered in his mind. It was a sight he never thought he'd see. A man who had once been buried beneath the weight of his own sorrow, now standing tall, finding joy again. It was proof that healing was possible, that even in the darkest times, there was always a way back to the light. The following spring, Harper's Ridge bloomed with life. The once snow-covered streets were now lined with vibrant greenery, and the town seemed to hum with renewed energy. For Jack, it was a season of reflection, a time to look back on the journey he had walked with Eli and to appreciate how far they had both come. Eli had thrown himself into his new role at the Veterans Group, becoming a mentor and a source of strength for the other members. He shared his story openly, not shying away from the pain and the hardships, but also emphasizing the importance of community and connection. The other veterans respected him deeply, and it wasn't long before Eli became a key figure in the group, guiding others through their own struggles with the same patience and compassion that had been shown to him. Rex, of course, had grown into a rambunctious but loyal companion. The puppy brought constant joy to Eli's life, reminding him that even after loss, there was still room for new love and new beginnings. Jack often visits, spending time with Eli and Rex on their long walks through the park or quiet afternoons on the porch. One warm afternoon, Jack stopped by Eli's house for their usual coffee. As he pulled up, he noticed something new in the front yard: a garden. The once neglected patch of earth had been transformed into a thriving space, full of colorful flowers and neatly planted vegetables. Jack smiled as he walked up the path, feeling a deep sense of pride in what Eli had accomplished. Eli greeted him at the door, his face lit up with a smile. "What do you think?" he asked, gesturing toward the garden. "It looks amazing," Jack replied, genuinely impressed. "I didn't know you had a green thumb." Eli chuckled. "I didn't either. But it turns out I've got a lot more time and energy these days. Figured I'd put it to good use." They sat on the porch, sipping their coffee and watching Rex chase a butterfly through the garden. Jack couldn't help but marvel at the transformation. The man sitting beside him was not the same Eli Barnes he had met all those months ago. This Eli was alive, full of purpose, full of hope. As they talked, Eli opened up about the veterans he had been helping, sharing stories of the men who had come to him for guidance, just as he had once gone to Jack. "There's one guy," Eli said, his voice soft with understanding. "He reminds me a lot of myself. Stubborn, doesn't want to ask for help. But I'm working on him. He's starting to come around." Jack smiled, feeling a swell of pride for his friend. "That's because you know what it's like to be in his shoes. You've walked that road, Eli, and now you're helping him find his way." Eli nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "I guess that's what it's all about, isn't it? Giving back, making sure no one else feels like they have to go through it alone." Jack couldn't have said it better himself. As the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the garden, Eli turned to Jack, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. "You know, I never thought I'd find peace again," Eli admitted. "After Margaret, after Buddy, I didn't think I had anything left to give. But you showed me that I wasn't finished yet. You reminded me that I still had something to offer." Jack smiled, his heart full. "You did the hard work, Eli. You found your way back." Eli nodded, his eyes misty. "I guess I did." They sat in silence for a moment, watching as Rex settled down in the garden, his head resting on his paws. The peace of the moment wrapped around them like a warm blanket, and Jack felt a deep sense of contentment. "I don't know what the future holds," Eli said softly, his voice barely audible over the breeze. "But I'm not afraid of it anymore. Whatever comes next, I'm ready." Jack reached over and clasped Eli's hand, his grip firm but full of understanding. "You've got this, Eli. Whatever comes next, you're ready for it." As the evening light faded into dusk, Jack knew that this was the beginning of something new, not just for Eli, but for both of them. They had walked through the darkness together, and now, as the world moved forward, they were ready to face whatever lay ahead. Because in the end, it wasn't about the battles they had fought. It wasn't about the losses or the grief or the pain. It was about the love they had found along the way. And that love, the love of friendship, of community, of a loyal dog, of a life well lived, was what would carry them forward, no matter what the future held. The months that followed felt like a whirlwind of change. But for Eli Barnes, the transformation was slow, deliberate, and deeply meaningful. Jack watched with pride as Eli became an active member of the veterans group, not just attending meetings, but leading discussions, helping others navigate the same struggles he had once faced. Eli had gone from being the lost man sitting on his porch, clinging to his old life, to someone who had found purpose again, a mentor, a guide, a friend. Rex had grown into a strong, loyal dog. His boundless energy was a constant reminder to Eli that life kept moving forward, and no matter how much he missed Buddy, there was still room in his heart for new love. The once crumbling house had been transformed, thanks to the tireless work of the community. What had been a place of isolation and despair was now a beacon of resilience and hope. One cool autumn evening, Jack stopped by Eli's house for what had become their regular Friday night dinners. Eli had insisted on cooking, and Jack never turned down the offer. It had become a ritual of sorts, a way to mark the progress Eli had made. Jack pulled up to the house, admiring the neat garden and the soft light glowing from the windows. As he stepped onto the porch, the door swung open, and Eli greeted him with a warm smile. "You're just in time," Eli said, stepping aside to let Jack in. "Dinner's almost ready." The smell of roasted chicken and vegetables filled the air, and Jack's stomach growled in anticipation. "Smells amazing," Jack said, hanging his jacket on the hook by the door. "You've become quite the chef." Eli chuckled as he headed back to the kitchen, where Rex lay curled up in the corner, watching him with adoring eyes. "I had to learn eventually," Eli said. "Can't live off frozen dinners forever." They sat down to eat, the conversation flowing easily between them. They talked about the veterans group, about Tom Henderson's latest project in the neighborhood, and about Rex, who had settled into his role as Eli's faithful companion. Jack could see the light in Eli's eyes, the sense of fulfillment that had been missing for so long. But as the evening wore on, the conversation took a more reflective turn. Eli set down his fork, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Jack," he began, his voice quiet, "I've been thinking a lot about the past, about how far I've come since everything fell apart." Jack nodded, sensing the weight of Eli's words. "You've come a long way, Eli. You've rebuilt your life." Eli sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Yeah, but it wasn't just me. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. If you hadn't kept showing up, pushing me to keep going, I don't know where I'd be." Jack leaned back in his chair, his eyes soft with understanding. "I didn't do anything you couldn't have done yourself, Eli. I just reminded you of what you were capable of. The rest? That was all you." Eli shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're too modest, Jack. You gave me hope when I didn't have any left. You showed me that I wasn't alone. That's something I'll never forget." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. "You're a good man, Eli. You've been through more than most people can imagine, but you came out the other side stronger. And now you're helping others do the same. That's something to be proud of." For a moment, the two men sat in silence, the weight of their shared journey hanging between them. Then Eli spoke again, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "I've been thinking about Margaret a lot lately," he admitted, his eyes growing distant. "About the life we built together, and how hard it was to let go after she passed. I spent so many years holding on to that pain, afraid to move forward because I didn't want to leave her behind." Jack listened, his heart heavy with empathy. He knew how much Margaret had meant to Eli, how her loss had sent him into the spiral of grief that had nearly consumed him. "But I realize now," Eli continued, his voice growing stronger, "that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean letting go of the people we've loved. It just means carrying them with us, in a different way." Jack nodded, feeling a swell of emotion. "Margaret would be proud of you, Eli. She'd be proud of the man you are now." Eli smiled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I like to think so," he whispered. "And I think I'm finally ready to start living again. Really living." Jack reached across the table, placing a hand on Eli's arm. "You've already started, Eli. And you've got a lot of life left to live." The next few weeks brought even more changes to Eli's life. He had become a pillar of the veterans group, organizing events, leading discussions, and even helping new members navigate the emotional and bureaucratic challenges that came with being a veteran. Eli had found his purpose again, and with it came a renewed sense of pride in who he was. One afternoon, Eli invited Jack to attend a veterans group meeting. Jack had never been to one of the meetings before, but he knew how important they were to Eli, so when Eli asked, Jack didn't hesitate to accept. The meeting was held in a modest room at the community center, a space that had become a refuge for men and women who had served their country and were now trying to find their way in the civilian world. As Jack entered the room, he saw familiar faces, veterans of all ages, some in their 20s, others well into their 60s and 70s. There was a sense of camaraderie in the air, an unspoken understanding between the people gathered there. Eli stood at the front of the room, speaking to the group with the quiet confidence of someone who had walked through fire and come out the other side. Jack watched with admiration as Eli shared his story, openly discussing his struggles with grief, loss, and isolation. But more than that, Eli spoke of hope, of the importance of community, of reaching out for help, and of the strength that came from leaning on others. As Eli spoke, Jack could see how much the other veterans respected him. They listened intently, nodding along with his words, their eyes filled with the same pain, the same understanding. And when Eli finished, there was a quiet moment of reflection, followed by the kind of applause that wasn't about performance, but about appreciation. Appreciation for the man who had been brave enough to share his truth. After the meeting, Eli and Jack sat outside the community center, watching as the other veterans filed out. Rex, who had become a regular fixture at these meetings, sat at Eli's feet, his tail wagging lazily as he dozed in the afternoon sun. "You were great in there," Jack said, turning to Eli with a smile. Eli shrugged, though Jack could see pride in his eyes. "I just told my story. It's nothing special." "It's more than special," Jack replied. "You're helping those men in ways you probably don't even realize. You're giving them hope, Eli, just like you found your own." Eli smiled, looking down at Rex, who was now snoozing contentedly. "It feels good to give back," he admitted. "I spent so long thinking I had nothing left to offer. But now, I see that I do. And it's because you didn't give up on me, Jack." Jack shook his head, his voice soft. "I never gave up on you because I knew you weren't done yet, Eli. And look at you now. You're thriving. You found a new path." Eli's expression grew thoughtful, his eyes softening as he gazed out at the horizon. "Yeah, I guess I have." The two men sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of their journey shared between them. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. And as they sat there, Jack couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. This was what it had all been for, the long nights, the hard conversations, the moments of doubt and fear. It had all led to this, to Eli finding his way back to life, rediscovering the strength and love he thought he had lost. After a while, Eli spoke again, his voice quiet but filled with resolve. "I think I'm ready to take another step," he said. I've been thinking about getting more involved with the local VA, maybe working with some of the younger vets who are just coming home, helping them transition. Jack smiled, feeling a surge of pride for his friend. That's a great idea, Eli. You'd be perfect for that. Eli nodded, his eyes filled with determination. It's time to keep moving forward. I've been given a second chance, and I don't want to waste it. You won't, Jack said firmly. I know you won't. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Jack and Eli stood, ready to head home. Rex, ever the loyal companion, bounded ahead, his tail wagging in excitement as they walked toward the car. Before they parted ways, Eli turned to Jack, his expression serious but filled with gratitude. You've been a good friend to me, Jack. I wouldn't be here without you. Jack smiled, placing a hand on Eli's shoulder. You don't have to thank me, Eli. That's what friends are for. Eli nodded, his eyes softening. Still, I want you to know how much it means to me. You helped me find my way back. Jack's heart swelled with emotion. And I'll always be here, Eli. No matter what. With that, the two men parted ways, each walking a path they knew they wouldn't have to walk alone. Jack watched as Eli and Rex disappeared down the street, a sense of peace settling over him. Eli had found his way back to life, back to hope, back to love, back to himself. And Jack knew, deep in his heart, that no matter what the future held, Eli would keep moving forward. Because in the end, that's what life was about. It wasn't about the pain or the loss or the grief. It was about love. And the love Jack knew was what would carry them all through, no matter how dark the days might get. Months later, as spring blossomed into full bloom, Eli stood at the edge of his garden, watching Rex dart back and forth between the rows of flowers. The sky was brilliant blue, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh earth and new beginnings. It was a day like any other, but for Eli it felt like a milestone, a quiet moment of reflection on how far he had come. Rex trotted over to Eli, nudging his hand with his nose. Eli smiled, crouching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. You've been good for me, boy, he murmured. You've been a real gift. As Eli stood, he glanced toward the horizon, where the town of Harper's Ridge stretched out before him. It had been a long road, full of pain and heartache, but Eli had found his way back to life. He had found a new purpose in helping others, in giving back to the community that had saved him. And most importantly, he had found the strength to carry on, one day at a time, one step at a time. Eli took a deep breath, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. He knew that there would still be hard days, days when the weight of loss and grief would creep back in. But now, he had the tools to face those days. He had friends, he had purpose, and he had hope. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting warm rays across the garden, Eli turned and headed back toward the house, Rex trotting happily beside him. The road ahead was still unwritten, but Eli knew one thing for certain. He was ready for whatever came next. And he would face it with love, with courage, and with the quiet strength that had carried him through so many storms. Because no matter how dark the night might get, Eli had learned one thing above all else: the light always returns. The years passed slowly, but with each new season, Eli's life continued to bloom in ways he had never expected. The house that had once felt so empty now thrived with laughter, love, and purpose. Rex was no longer the playful pup he had been, but now a strong, reliable companion who stuck by Eli's side as faithfully as Buddy once had. The garden that Eli had nurtured grew larger each year, a living testament to his own journey. What had started as a small patch of dirt now flourished with vibrant flowers, vegetables, and the occasional visiting butterfly that Rex always tried to chase. Eli had become a cornerstone of the community. People in Harper's Ridge knew his story, knew how far he had come from those dark days of isolation, and they looked to him for guidance, advice, and support. The veterans group had expanded, thanks in large part to Eli's leadership, and many of the men who once walked the same path of despair now found hope and comfort in his words. Jack remained a constant presence in Eli's life. The two of them had forged a bond that went deeper than friendship. It was family. They had both walked through fire, and now they stood on the other side, stronger for it. Jack had been promoted at the police department, but despite his busy schedule, he always made time to check in on Eli, to share a cup of coffee on the porch, and to talk about life, both the good and the hard parts. One warm summer afternoon, Eli stood on his porch, looking out at the familiar sight of Harper's Ridge. The town had changed in small ways. New businesses had sprung up, a few old houses had been torn down or renovated, but in many ways, it remained the same. There was comfort in that stability, knowing that while time moved forward, some things stayed constant. Rex lay at Eli's feet, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed in the dappled sunlight. The dog was getting older now, his fur peppered with gray around the muzzle, but he still had that same spark of loyalty and love that had defined their relationship from the start. Eli reached down and scratched behind Rex's ears, feeling the familiar warmth of companionship that never failed to bring a smile to his face. As Eli watched the street, he noticed a familiar figure walking up the path toward his house. Jack, wearing his police uniform, waved as he approached, his face breaking into a wide grin. "Afternoon, Eli," Jack called out as he climbed the steps to the porch. "You busy?" Eli smiled, shaking his head. "Just enjoying the weather. Pull up a chair." Jack settled into the old wooden chair next to Eli, leaning back and sighing contentedly. "I don't know how you do it," Jack said, nodding toward the garden. "Every time I come by, it looks better than before." Eli chuckled, gazing out at the neatly tended rows of plants and flowers. "I guess I've got a lot of time on my hands, plus it keeps me busy, keeps me grounded." Jack nodded, sipping the glass of iced tea that Eli handed him. "You've built something special here, Eli. This place, your garden, the veterans group, it's all a reflection of you." Eli's expression grew thoughtful, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "I've had a lot of help along the way. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you, Jack. You pushed me when I needed it. You reminded me that I still had something to give." Jack shook his head, his voice soft. "You did the hard work, Eli. I just made sure you didn't give up on yourself." For a long moment they sat in silence, the gentle hum of summer surrounding them. Rex lifted his head to sniff the air, then laid back down, content to stay in the shade. After a while, Eli spoke again, his voice filled with quiet reflection. "I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately," he said. "About what we leave behind when we're gone. Margaret, buddy, they're always with me, but I want to make sure that what I do here now matters." Jack turned to him, his expression serious. "Eli, you've already created a legacy. You've touched so many lives, the veterans you've helped, the people in this community. You've made a difference, and that's something that'll live on long after any of us are gone." Eli nodded, though his face was still lined with thought. "I hope you're right. I guess I just want to make sure that the things I've learned, the things I've gone through, help someone else. That no one else feels like they have to go through what I did." "They won't," Jack said firmly, "because you've shown them the way. You've been their guide, their mentor, and that's a legacy no one can take away." Eli smiled softly, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You know, Jack," he said, his voice tinged with emotion, "I never thought I'd find peace again. But sitting here, looking out at this garden, watching Rex sleep, talking with you, I realized that I have. I've found it. And that's more than I ever thought I'd get." Jack felt his chest tighten with emotion, but he managed to smile. "You deserve that peace, Eli. You've earned it." As the afternoon wore on, they continued to talk about the future, about life, about the simple joys that made it all worth living. And though there were still moments of sadness, moments when the weight of the past crept back in, there was also hope. Hope that the love they had found, the love of friends, family, and community, would carry them through whatever came next. Several years passed and Harper's Ridge continued to thrive. The town grew in small ways, with new families moving in, new businesses opening, and the community staying as close-knit as ever. Eli's garden became a local landmark, a symbol of resilience and renewal, and his work with the Veterans Group continued to inspire others. Eli, now in his late 70s, had grown a little slower, but his spirit remained as strong as ever. Rex, too, had aged, though he was still as loyal and loving as the day Eli brought him home. They were inseparable, and together they enjoyed the quiet life they had built, a life filled with meaning, with purpose, and with the peace Eli had long sought. One day, Jack received a letter in the mail. It was from the town council of Harper's Ridge, inviting him to a special ceremony in Eli's honor. The Veterans Group had decided to name a community garden after Eli, a lasting tribute to the man who had given so much to the town and to the people around him. On the day of the ceremony, Jack stood in the middle of the newly dedicated Eli Barnes Memorial Garden, surrounded by familiar faces, veterans, neighbors, friends, all of whom had been touched by Eli's kindness, his wisdom, and his strength. Eli stood beside him, Rex at his feet, a look of quiet pride on his face. As the mayor gave a speech, recounting Eli's journey and the impact he had made on the community, Jack couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride for his friend. Eli had come so far from the dark days of isolation and grief to this moment of recognition, where his legacy would live on long after he was gone. When the ceremony ended, Eli turned to Jack, his eyes misty with emotion. "I never thought I'd see something like this," he said quietly. "But I guess life has a way of surprising you." Jack smiled, clapping a hand on Eli's shoulder. "You earned this, Eli. Every bit of it." Eli nodded, looking out at the garden that now bore his name. "I guess I did," he said, his voice filled with quiet wonder. As the crowd dispersed, Eli and Jack walked through the garden, the flowers in full bloom, the air filled with the scent of life and renewal. Rex trotted along beside them, his tail wagging happily, and in that moment Jack knew that Eli's legacy, his love, his kindness, his resilience, would continue to grow, just like the flowers in this garden. It would spread, touching the lives of everyone who came here, reminding them that no matter how dark life might get, there was always a way back to the light. Eli had found his peace, and in doing so, he had given peace to so many others. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey with Eli Barnes and Jack Carter, a story of resilience, hope, and the power of community. If you find yourself touched by their journey, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss more heartwarming stories like this one. We'd love to hear from you. What part of Eli's story resonated most with you? Leave a comment below, and let's continue the conversation. Remember, no matter how difficult life gets, there is always a way back to the light. Stay connected, stay hopeful, and as always, thank you for watching.